Hi guys, it's the 13th of July. I just wanted to get together and have a quick discussion about the recent indicators and actions for consideration for clients that we came up with, both positive and negative indicators for the Ukraine and Russia conflict. Obviously, we're trying to anticipate what's going to occur in the workload of our clients from the risk management perspective. And of course, there are both positive and negative forecasts we need to make. The technical term, of course, for that is indicators. Guys, just to get the discussion going, obviously, if Russia withdraws, I'm looking at a positive indicator now, obviously, but if Russia withdraws or downscales troop presence from the Ukrainian territory in the east, Ukraine potentially agrees to a degree of demilitarization to limit destruction and damage in its east would be an example of a positive indicator. And then various actions would unfold. Can we just discuss the type of actions that clients may need to consider?
So, Paul, if we are looking at a positive indicator of Russia reducing their troop presence, especially in the east, and Ukraine agreeing to demilitarize, however unlikely that may be, businesses need to ensure that they track the business environment at the ground level. And the sanctions especially are unlikely to be withdrawn or rescinded with minor demilitarization or reduction of troops. The sanctions are squarely targeted at the business environment in Russia, and they're trying to hit as close to home as possible to Putin. So businesses need to watch out for developments in terms of sanctions as well as business environment on the ground. Yes, at the surface level, demilitarization or withdrawal of troops may seem like more conducive, but supply chains are very complicated to restore. So, and the infrastructure has been hit really hard. So businesses need to closely look at where exactly they want to return, if at all they're planning to, especially in central and eastern Ukraine. Any further comments on that?
Yeah,
Uday?
I mean, yeah. So if they do decide to, re-enter, I mean, businesses should take a staggered approach and kind of see how things are going, because a flexible approach will help adapt to, fluctuations in the conflict, and it could be even travel restrictions and figuring out how to deal with the sanctions and compliance with laws to ensure the safety of personnel. So a high degree of flexibility is needed, and you can't go in all guns blazing at this point.
Yeah, look, and I think one of the key things that clients are going to struggle with is there's commercial realities of the sanctions hitting their abilities to do business in Russia. There's a supply chain complexities. There's going to come a point in the future, probably a long way off, that the sales teams need to go back in and regenerate it. They need to work out commercial recovery from having upset Russia post the conflict and what model they're going to be able to use, whether they have to use a partnering model with a local entity to get back in there. But there's obviously both the legal and the security ramifications of the precarious situation that may exist. I mean, simple things like Finland and Sweden's NATO membership, if that were to get rejected, that'd be a positive indicator in terms of the security paradigm. And I need to state that positive indicators mean it's positive in the security environment, or the risk paradigm decreases. So I guess if we flick over to a negative scenario, Russia escalates military campaigns against Ukraine, what kind of considerations should clients be looking at there internally? And of course, we've just mentioned that that's more than just the security side. Uday?
I think one thing to look at, Paul, is definitely the supply chains and how the gas crisis is unfolding in Europe, especially in Germany. It seems like there will be massive shortages across Europe over the coming months, and while these countries are trying to find alternatives, that's a more long-term issue. So at this point, business and industries can really be affected. And if Russia escalates a military campaign against Ukraine, it could use this as leverage further.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think there's a lot of complexities in Europe. I mean, we've spoken infinitum about NATO's role and Europe and America's role in actually putting Russia in a position where it saw on its borders an existential threat. Ironically, Europe borders with Russia, and Europe's now in a position where it's kind of, along with that NATO expansionism, has now got into a conflict date of the sanctions Europe is making, and Finland and Sweden, obviously part of Europe, on the east of Europe now, on the borders with Russia. So they're confronting their biggest energy supplier. So that was always going to be a very awkward position for them. What is really important for clients to do is continue to monitor. If you look at the US UK joint currency power and the ruble relative power, I think a lot of the Western countries expected the ruble to be impacted greatly, but it's proven not to be the case. There are attempts to target and hurt the ruble, but at this stage it's proving incredibly resilient. And I don't think the West or NATO or Europe was expecting that. And I think the combination of the legal complexities and the commercial complexities for clients is such that supply chain issues aren't going away. They may even not go away after the conflict, because Russia's proven to have a lot of economic resilience. And of course, China's position, sitting back, learning a lot from this, is something that clients really need to take on board. Bhargav, some observations?
Certainly, Paul. I think the intensification of conflicts will only push Europe to the brink. And now Nord Stream pipeline is shut for maintenance, quote unquote maintenance. So, so if they do not really restore the supply by 21st or 25th of July, they are slated to reopen after maintenance. It is going to push Europe to a brink. Now, that in itself may not be as negative, primarily because of the business opportunity. Of course, it depends on the feasibility of supply chains and supply. There are other suppliers such as the US and Qatar, and they are trying to still figure out the supply chains and the capacity, as well as the pricing and how compatible the market would be for getting supplies through ships. But at the moment, the kind of volume we are talking about, that seems to be unfeasible. But it's certainly a business opportunity for the other players. Russia's loss is their gain, but at the same time, Russia holds key to energy security in Europe, irrespective of what alternate supply chains there may be.
Which is interesting. If you look at the various gas supply and price cycles, it's almost like the choosing of the time where Russia attacked Ukraine is linked to when the price of gas and energy is high, and the actual conflict made it higher, which played into Russia's hands. So also, basically, Europe, supported all the talk about Ukraine joining NATO, which led to a war, and now they've encouraged Finland and Sweden to join, which is exacerbating their energy problems. And of course, Europe has its own internal issues. The UK have already left. Others are getting tired of having to fund Europe. It's getting more and more kind of run by left-wing, capitalistic, idealistic economic managers that may not be understanding the pragmatic reality of dealing with Russia on the east, which sees life extremely differently. Uday, you're very quiet there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, regarding what you just said about Finland and Sweden, Paul, I'm completely on the same page. If their membership gets approved, this will polarize the West versus Russia, and in that we could potentially see in the long term a rise in alternate financial systems that's not based on Western institutions. Specifically, we could see more China playing a big part in this, and Russia could back them. And as you mentioned, the ruble is doing well at this point. And countries have started paying in rubles now instead of US dollars for Russian oil and gas supplies. So I think there could be a fundamental shift in the way the world economy runs away from the West at this point. And so that will be something, again, businesses will have to be flexible to these kind of changes in the long term.
And I think they've got to deal with the reality that perhaps they're seeing everything that's happening in Russia and Ukraine through a very myopic viewpoint, and one that's been fed to them by Western leaders and Western media acting for or subconsciously or inadvertently for the Western leadership. They're not potentially seeing this for what it is beyond that immediate political spectrum, but rather, the polarization of the global economies, and perhaps even we may be seeing the beginning of, I don't want to say the Third World War, but certainly a split so strong that it's splitting the economy, splitting political beliefs, splitting economic beliefs along a Western and East line. So businesses have to see this for what it is, and that's much bigger than a simple invasion. As unpleasant as that is, there are a whole lot greater array of issues and impacts that are spinning off from this at a geopolitical level. Bhargav, any closing comment?
Paul, one other angle I would like to look at, especially for businesses, would be how does China play into this? Because China has a captive market that is Russia with growing sanctions. But again, China has cleverly hooked the entire West onto their cheap labor and their factories within China. So if the sanctions intensify, will China isolate Russia? Will they withdraw from Russia? And to me personally, I think that would not be a prudent move by Russia and China, basically, because China would be losing a captive market, and China is going to dominate Russia for the next coming decades. And as far as the businesses in the West and Chinese businesses in the West is concerned, I believe China is prudent and blunt enough to deflect and sidestep the sanctions. They have done it before, and they're going to do it again. Any thoughts on that, Paul?
I do. I spent an hour today talking at a economic think tank here on this very matter. And I wasn't supposed to be speaking at it. I was a guest at it, but it was kind of barbarianism at its best. They were basically saying that China's getting very, very aggressive and looking to target, because it controls the solar capacity of the globe. And I basically raised my hand and said, rather than are targeting global domination because they've got ability to control production on solar and even rare earth minerals that are necessary for the battery and the capacities and various other elements. How about this? The West isn't as efficient and can't produce stuff and can't do long-term planning like China, so we should be patting them on the back and going, extremely efficient, extremely good governance, well planning, but we have to make them the demon. Now, if we look at just my country, and I'm currently in Sydney, but if we look at our country, high labour costs, virtually no unemployment for anyone that actually has a work ethic or isn't unfortunately disabled, but we won't bring in immigration because the guy that doesn't want to go and get a labouring work because we give him unemployment benefits thinks that if there's immigration there, it's going to deprive him from being a doctor or a brain surgeon in the coming months. As a result, Australia has to appease its domestic workforce, and so it won't bring in immigration. And because it won't bring in immigration, it can't bring down its cost of production. And the way of dealing with an inefficient economy is, I think 17% of our last quarter's GDP was either coal or iron ore. If you then go and add all the other stuff we rip out of the ground and sell abroad, just naming a few, uranium, gold, copper, nickel, not to mention our agriculture. But basically we have to harvest the environment and send it abroad, but we don't add any value. So I think what China's doing, Bhargav, is sitting back and continuing its 10, 50, 100-year plans. And it's laughing a lot because it really doesn't care much about Western leaders trying to maintain their own popular face by manipulating media, manipulating the people to think like they think. And it's got a whole heap of, American, British analysts, ex-military forces, current and ex-public service, all on this bandwagon that China's evil, Russia's even more evil. Meanwhile, China's just sitting back and planning its domination. I mean, it's not a case of, is it going to be the leading superpower? You can see the desperation from America 20 years ago. We're pulling out of APAC and we're racing over with Team America to control the Middle East. Now they're trying to come back to Asia. They're trying to come back to the Pacific because China filled the void. It's too late. The horse bolted through that gate a long time ago. If you act with arrogance and a myopic view at a geopolitical level, and you have a country run as efficiently and as ruthlessly as China, you can pretend you're number one, but you're not. I mean, on a purchasing parity basis now, China's already the biggest economy, and it won't be long before on a straight US dollar. Throw into that a massive population, albeit their biggest problem is going to be an aging population, but they've got efficiencies of just a danger of the population. I think the only real fear that China has is India, but of course, India is a lot better in theory and on the pulpit with Mr. Modi than the reality of trying to become a unified force like China. So, I mean, there's some very ruthless, blunt comments. Bhargav, the India factor, perhaps Uday could mention or just build on that comment I made.
Certainly, Paul. To be very blunt, India has a big problem of arrogance. They think a little too much of themselves, and they think they're way ahead of the West in terms of democratic principles, policies, and whatnot. But as far as governance is concerned on the ground, they are big fat zero, of course, with some developments on the ground level with infrastructure. The current government thinks building railroads and flyovers and roads that's all there is to it. But as far as doing business is concerned, they have actually increased the complexity with flawed implementation of fairly decent policies such as GST, it may be, and you can also bring in the demonetization for that matter.
Yes,
but the way they were implemented, they created more problems than they solved anything. So, and that is at the heart of the core issue why India is highly unlikely that it is going to match up to China on the economic front. On the other side of it, there is a certain capacity in manufacturing what China has expertise in, and India does not have that. India is fairly, and it is continued to focus on outsourced software rather than having an expertise in manufacturing, and that has hit India hard. Of course, there are a few examples like automotive industry. I mean, it is an export market. Some companies export more than they export from their own home countries, like Hyundai, but that doesn't really solve much. India needs to plan well ahead, and it needs to support its manufacturing industries way more than basically outsource sweatshops in Bangalore or in Pune for major banks and supermarkets in the West, who basically do 60% of their back-end work in India. So that's not going to help Indian economy in the long run at all.
Problem that Australia, England, America, and many other major democracies have, and that is you fundamentally have a couple of political parties and their job is each election cycle to fool the fools and get elected and then try to be popular. But compared to China's ability to do long-term planning and implement the plans, and they can't get away with just blatantly lying to everybody, which seems to have become popular in the West and acceptable in the West. So India's biggest problem is, in fact, that it is the world's largest democracy, and from an efficiency of governance, long-term planning, that may be an insurmountable problem for India's wealth and growth. Now, look, that there's another 17 indicators we've come up with in those positive and negative indicators. I think we've probably covered off enough. Uday, a final comment from you at all?
No, Paul, I think we're good. We've given a good picture.
All right. Thanks, chaps. Appreciate it. Cheers.